Meer from The Guardian, and to George Butler, the illustrator. Thank you.
Hiya. So I'm Malik. I'm the features editor of The Guardian. I edit the G2 section, and we ran quite a lot of George's illustrations, which then went on to win the V&A Illustration Award. We won 2 V&A Illustration Awards. Is that right?
One and a different one.
But I think we're just going to start by handing over to George to talk us through his work, and then we'll come back to a Q&A at the end.
Great. Do you want to dim those? So I've only ever been here in the audience and always continually inspired by the people on the stage. But there's one person who perhaps I always associate with the Frontline Club, and you would have walked past him as you came up the stairs. And he's called Felix Topolsky. He was a war artist in Britain, having fled Poland just before the Second World War. And more interestingly, he then went on for about 20 years recording places around the world, from the Harlem riots to the coronation in England. And it's that concept, that idea of hand-drawn witness accounts of things on the street, which he then printed in an arch under Waterloo and sold to whoever subscribed. It's that concept of reportage illustration that I want to try and sell to you tonight, and secretly also pitch a project to Malik, although I haven't told him about that. Well, I've just been in Lebanon, so I'm going to try and all convince him that it's a good idea. So, have you? Very difficult not going to see anybody. Have you ever come back from a holiday, and a brilliant holiday, and the first question you've been asked is, what was it like? You may have had a surge of inspiration to explain exactly what the last 7 days were like, and yet your answer, we had a lovely time, beautiful beaches, fantastic people, may or may not have done it justice. Or a week later, you're showing your family the photographs, and it's always a difficult thing to do, and you begin flicking through. They can see on the screen 20 of 750, 21, 22, 23. With all the will in the world, they can't see what you saw, 24, 25, 26, or feel what you felt. For me, this is a bit like the way we receive our news, the modern day news. Thousands of sources of information that only really confuse us about issues that we might otherwise care a great deal about. And today I'd like to try and offer an alternative to that, not a replacement by any means, but an alternative, and that's drawing. Drawing or illustration is not a new concept when it comes to recording the news. Felix Topolsky did it, and indeed 160 years ago, thousands of weekly illustrated periodicals were sold in Britain every day. And it's sad because within 60 years, by the end of the Second World War, it had almost entirely been replaced by photography. And in fact, during the 20th century, our obsession with it, with its immediacy, had meant that it was almost entirely lost, or illustration was entirely lost. So this year marks the centenary of World War I, and despite the capabilities of photography and film, it was in fact recorded in paintings and drawings. And these are the things we remember. They are the pictures that describe to us what it was like. And they are, in fact, the things that remain on our walls, our museum walls today. So I guess the question is, can it really come full circle? Could we ever get back to that proven solution, favoured solution of using illustrations over photography? And tonight I'm going to show you some drawings that I made in Syria 18 months ago and in Lebanon last week. So there's a very brief backstory, but in August 2012 I was kicked out of my flat for the Olympics, and instead of spending the rent money I'd saved on sleeping on another sofa, I thought I'd buy a flight to Turkey and a bus to the Syrian border, where where the conversation I had with the guard was not quite what I'd imagined. I thought it was going to be difficult to talk my way in, and in fact, I arrived there and showed him my passport, and he waved me straight through. And then just kind of try and explain the sort of situation there. You walk in, and it's 3 or 4 kilometres walk. On your right is a large refugee camp, about 12,000 people. On the left, an old duty-free shop, a long line of white minibuses waiting for more refugees to arrive, a well-signposted minefield, and you get to a gate, a very friendly man with a Kalashnikov, and he sort of waves you, he points you in the right direction to the border post. There I'm a man called Fadi, who is this wonderful sort of smiling man, shook me by the hand and lay his on his chest in that kind of reassuring Arabic way. And I explained to him in quite careful English what I wanted to do, that I'd like to describe the situation facing the civilians and some of the opposition forces. And he, of course, looked up from his desk and spoke in fluent English, said, "What do you want to do? Where do you want to go? Do you need a car? Do you need a translator?" And that was quite a relief. So today I'm going to show you why I believe illustration is as valuable, as valid, and as viable as photography and film in recording the news. So the first thing I saw when I walked into Syria was an abandoned tank. The second, a petrol station blown inside out. The third, a collapsed mosque. Children rotating the turret of a tank, their new climbing frame. Another lad collecting the bolts out of the bottom of another to be recycled later. And it became all the more real when I found myself standing on a pile of bullet casings, feeling a very long way away from home, and knowing that someone must have been here being shot at and shooting back, but not knowing what happened between then and now. And as an illustrator, you're free to interpret the scene, the elements that inspire you. So I don't know if you can imagine, if you were faced with the task of drawing this scene, what you would leave in, what would you leave out, how would you not just paint a pretty picture, but describe the story? And this was my interpretation of it. So while I was there, I really noticed the detail, the weight of the tank in front of me, and the children playing on top of it. One of them, you can't quite see on here, wearing a new look top, and all of that in contrast to the white space, perhaps less relevant information on the left. But of course, the absence of one highlights the importance of the other. And this was the image that Malik published in the G2. So nice to be given, or just a relief to be given any space at all, but also done properly in that Martin Chuloff, who lives in Beirut, wrote the article, and for the first time, for me, the job of a kind of photographer had been swapped with the job of the illustrator, so the two had been matched side by side, which was great.
It's interesting that Martin since told me that even though he'd been reporting in Syria for a couple of years, this was one of his favourite pieces, partly because of the illustrations, because he thought they just offered a whole new dimension to the reporting.
I think they let people quite often use their imagination, if you know a bit about the subject already. This was the bakery in Azaz, which is the closest town to the border of Turkey, a place called Kilis. And it was my brief, although I was alone at the time, it was my sort of self-appointed brief, not to draw it with photographic accuracy, but to describe it as an experience, or the experience of people around me. And so as this scene unfolded, which is two separate bread queues each day at 11 o'clock, as it unfolded, the surroundings sort of influenced what I was doing. So the 40-degree heat made me draw quite quickly, the motorbikes, the constant noise in the motorbikes, and the people coming and going, that really gave it life whilst I was standing there. That immediacy, I hope, brings it to life. And in particular, I remember this man in the front right who summed up the scene for me. And if you'd been there, perhaps you would have picked something else, and that's why drawing is so personal. But for me, that back against the wall, head down, feet sort of pushed right in the front of his sandals really showed the kind of boredom and frustration of having to queue every day for something so basic, such a basic provision as bread. And my experience in Azaz at the time was a very vulnerable people returning to the town, which is now almost entirely deserted, to see if there's any news of their friends, and then try and continue with life as close to normality as possible. This is a man called Ismail who was just watering his goats in front of the same mosque, which has fallen down behind him, and a tank you can just see at the top. And again, the space in the paper was a relief to be able to tell the people who'd sort of trusted me to do it, to tell their stories. The market opening up for the first time in the town, and I think gives you an idea of the people's attitude. You can't see it very well here, but the fact that they are there and happy for you to be there whilst you're drawing gives you an idea of the sort of attitude that they had. So I think drawing also offers the viewer, the audience, if you like, a different perspective. It offers, encapsulates the passing of time in one image. And those 2 or 3 hours sat on the street, just observing quietly in the corner or with your back up against the wall, are invaluable. It's not just the snap of the shutter and then walking away. And these couple of images in particular confirmed to me that I didn't want to go to Aleppo to compete with the photographers who do a fantastic job of capturing the front line for the front page, but I wanted to offer a different angle, a more human angle, a fourth dimension that is understood to capture a period of time and then distill it into one image. So you get all the habits of that hour or 2 hours in one frame, and that worked particularly well in this instance, or as war as a subject. So the other thing I think is important is drawing is often considered a handshake, a way of communicating with people who, without necessarily speaking a common language. And I see it as a very open and honest process, one that people can see over your shoulder, they can see what you're doing, they recognise your friend, their friends, the places that they work perhaps. And importantly, they don't feel threatened, they're not made to feel uncomfortable or posed in any way. And what this means is that you're very often afforded access to places that you wouldn't otherwise be allowed to see. This is a prison in northern Syria, a police station in Azaz, and I was allowed to sit up against the bars drawing through. In particular, I remember this man who, for the entire time I was drawing, quite an intimidating way, just stared at me and didn't move. And it hadn't occurred to me that perhaps he knew exactly what I was doing or that he didn't mind. But after about 15 minutes, he sat up and gestured as to whether I'd finished and whether he was allowed to move. And so the kind of intimidating nature was completely lost. And it was just one of those moments I thought maybe it wouldn't have happened had I put a camera in his face. And even the terminology of photography I find quite aggressive. Cut, shoot, manipulate, action. But illustration is not like that. In fact, the audience, who are inevitably local to start with, are as interested in it as much as I am in them. But there have been some very difficult moments I found in Syria, in particular, to draw, and this was one of them. I was on the border of Syria and Turkey between Reyhanli and Bab al-Hawa, and with a charity called Syria Relief. This was a field hospital, and Firaz, the little boy, lost his mother, his brother, and his right leg 2 days before. And it occurred to me, just being there or just walking into the room, that my presence was completely mundane in comparison to their suffering. And on the one, it was quite confusing actually. On the one hand, I had the nurse coming in and ripping off the covers to reveal the naked body and the stump, because she was so keen that the story was told, that these stories needed to be told. And on the other, the father was translated as saying, Yasar, sitting in the bed, he was translated as saying that art makes no difference. And he may well be right. And then in the corner, thankfully translating for us all, there was a third man who was saying that these are the sorts of stories that need to be told so that people can understand the situation. And it was I was reassured by two things, I think. One, that just standing there and just being there but without a purpose was almost more insulting. So to offer some sort of justice to the scene, it would be nice to record it. And the second was that if you are going to do it in any shape or form, then perhaps illustration is a sensitive way of doing it. So I was going to stop there for a minute and just leave Syria behind and then do a little bit about Lebanon. I don't know.
Just before you go on to Lebanon, can we just ask you why, when you said you'd moved out your flat and off you went to Syria, what drove you to do that? What was your understanding of the situation before you went there, and what did you think you could offer?
Since I left uni, I've always tried to travel and draw and pick subjects that, a bit like Felix Topolsky did, or people like Ronald Searle or Gerald Scarfe used to do, but pick subjects that I thought I could offer a different angle on, that that had a story behind that interested me. Yeah. And being kicked out of my flat, as it turned out, was just an interesting opportunity to go and do something for a month. Yeah. And I'd always imagined that refugees coming across the border was quite a sensitive subject that perhaps you didn't want to stick cameras in their faces of, and so that was really my thinking. But as it turned out, when I arrived on the border, that wasn't the case, and I met somebody in the back of a shop, as you do, who suggested that now was as safe as time as any to go across the border. So it was almost quite naive, I suppose. Yeah. But having just turned up and met the Free Syrian Army and talked to them, I was kind of incredibly reassured that they didn't find it such an alien thing that someone was there, and that drawing seemed like a good way of telling their story, which is, of course, what they wanted to do at the time. Is that a good enough answer?
It's a good enough answer. Do you want to tell us about Lebanon? So you were there last week.
Yeah.
Okay. Where were you, and what were you doing, and what did you see?
I was there with a charity called Médecins du Monde, and they'd asked me to go with a writer and describe the sort of people that they were looking after, doing primary healthcare between Beirut and all the way up the Bekaa Valley. So you've got sort of Syria on the east, the border runs all the way down that side. And it was interesting. It was interesting because unlike Syria, where there are lots of things that showed you the kind of context of war, so tanks and wounded people and people with guns, this had none of that. So whereas Syria may have been a sort of small percentage of the story, sort of 5% shown in pictures, this was 1 million people, 1 million refugees in Lebanon, and this was much more close to normal life for them, because they were small families in tents. You can't go a mile in Lebanon without finding sort of 10 or 15 tents on the side of the road, and lots of children, lots of women. So it's quite a difficult story to tell, because there's no real visual, other than there's endless pictures that we see of tents and lots of children playing around. It's quite difficult to find a way into that. So I hope some of these drawings will kind of navigate that, but you'll probably have lots of difficult questions. So I was just going to kind of add to that. The first thing I got when we started driving up north in Lebanon was this text message, which you can either laugh or cry about, from the Ministry of Tourism in Syria, and it says, "The Ministry of Tourism welcomes you in Syria. Please call 137 for tourism information or complaints," with a capital C. And that was quite an odd text to get in amongst these millions of.
Did you call?
Millions of people. I didn't. We could call. You can call now if you want. So that was the beginning of it, and yes, just before we look through them, the idea was to depict the sort of women and children and their situation and some of their stories. Can we turn them down, Mary? This was the first scene, the Médecins du Monde mobile clinic, going around the villages. Everybody comes out, a bit of an opportunity to voice their concerns, but equally important time to address some of the issues of living in a camp, a tented settlement, I should say, brings out. As you can see, again, very welcoming people, not threatened by people being there. There was quite, to start off with, in every place we went to, there was this attitude that they'd spoken to a lot of people who'd offered help. All these NGOs had been through these places and spoken to them and offered help, and they quite often said, "We're bored of talking to people who mean well and smile a lot, but that we never see any of that aid coming back to us personally." So that was quite a difficult moment to navigate. This is a mental health consultation, another very intimidating moment to walk into a room of incredibly charismatic women all waiting for a sort of consultation to start, and all inevitably staring at you. But eventually one of them started speaking, and then they started. So I didn't know what she was talking about, but you could just tell it was incredibly emotional, and everybody started. Well, a lot of them started crying, but it was just such a great outlet for them, a moment to tell a story of the hardship that happened to them over the last year, and really interesting stories came out of this. And one in particular, a concept that it took me a while to try and understand, but basically, when the war first started, the abortion rate increased, because naturally people didn't want to have children in such horrific conditions. But actually in the camps in Lebanon, the birth rates are much higher, and it was associated with the fact that if you've come that close to dying, or you've suffered that much, that one of the things that you naturally want to do is have children and make sure that it hasn't all been a waste. And that was a difficult thing for me to, I don't know, just a very alien thing from anything I'd ever known. And this is a typical camp in a place called Kamed al-Loz. They often on the sides of them, they use these huge advertising boards that they might have nicked, or I don't know how they've got them, but you quite often get on the side of this one, you can see two big eyes, and it's like a makeup advertisement. They just stretched over their roofs, and there was a virgin one with like all sorts of strange things in complete juxtaposition to the families living inside. And almost everyone we spoke to, perhaps in contrast to when I was there the first time, said that they would go back home. The only condition would be they would go home if the fighting stopped. And it was interesting because actually I think in the press or in this country we often think that the political solution should be the first one to, if we could sort that out, then the rest would follow. But all the requirements of these Syrian refugees, the only requirement, if you like, was if the war stopped, we'd like to go home. And that was certainly something that changed in the sort of space of 18 months from when I first went to last week. And then we went inside the tents and spoke to the families, and I basically tried to work out a way of telling their stories without endlessly drawing them sitting all in a line on the floor. So I asked them all if they could bring out the belongings that they bought from Syria. And a lot of them had nothing, but we occasionally found a family that had bought a few things. And this was a family, a lady called Rawa and her son Maram. And the night she'd left, she'd grabbed a box of things because she knew that there would be a torch in it, and she had to cross the mountains at night where they stayed. And so she grabbed this torch, and when she arrived in Lebanon the next day, she'd found she'd had all these other things that she'd taken from her house. So the remote control for the Syrian television, Nokia batteries for a phone that is not around anymore, children's toys, her wedding ring, and sort of scissors, and a lot of them completely useless, but kept nonetheless now because there was no other connection with their house in Homs. And again, it was quite sort of slow in coming forward these very personal items, but originally the man, Hussein, just laid out his shaving kit because he didn't quite understand what I wanted. And then when we started talking about it, all these other things came out. So his wife Hinan produced a poem she'd written, a souvenir, the knife that they got on a holiday in Dubai. This one here is a photo of their son who they left behind in Syria so he can go to school, a 7-year-old son. A wedding photo at the bottom right of his wedding back in Syria, Katana, and then things like key rings they used to hang their keys on in their house, necklaces from their mother and sister. And we have this concept in England that, or not really a concept, a game you might play in the car. What would you save if your house was burning down, or if you had to leave and live on a desert island? And there's always sort of clever answers, luxuries that we might take with us. And in fact, the reality is nothing like that. It's the stuff the kids were carrying, the stuff you grabbed when the lights went out in your house and you had to leave, or when the shelling started, or when you came back through a checkpoint to go home and you weren't allowed through it, or whatever. You thought you were going away for a week, so you took some things, but not inevitably not enough. But the things they've kept just because that's the only memory of going home, and that's basically all they want to do. Broken hairbrushes, kids' toys, combs, and then some of these things become good luck. The thing in the brooch in the top right was her good luck charm, and then inevitably mobile phones and things as well. And then some people didn't have very much. Expired passports. This clock, in fact, was the only thing left unbroken in their destroyed house, and they didn't want to change the time because it was the time that had sort of stopped when they'd left Syria. Wedding rings and kids' marbles. So it's quite an interesting way of, I hope, of telling their stories. These were a couple of them. The woman on the left's called Moon, and she, rather kind of encouragingly, had been there for 2 years with her family, and had started to be self-sufficient in these camps. They had concrete floors, they had waterproof tents. The NGOs had stopped giving to them because they'd been considered sort of efficient enough to live on their own. And then on the right, Khalid, who is 2.5, so younger than the war itself, will have never known anything different. With sitting on his mum's lap, you can just see her hands around him, and his toy, which he rolled round and round, the bicycle wheel. So these last two images are back in Syria, and they're probably the most personal to me. They're the ones I think of when I sort of think about that time. And there was drawn in a mental health project in Turkey with a charity called Médecins Sans Frontières. This is a woman called Mama Nazik, who was this amazing, she's an amazing geography teacher from Damascus who'd been hung by her hands for 20 days under the Hafez al-Assad regime. So that was 30 years ago. And she showed me the sort of scarred tissue on her wrists still hanging off. She had 3 sons, all of which fought for the opposition, so against the regime. The first was shot through the arm. The second was killed outright trying to launch a rocket. And the third shot through the belly and then paralysed from the waist down, trying to save the first. For 50 minutes she sat opposite me. It was me and a couple of other people in the room, just always looking me in the eye, often with tears in her eyes. A transcript that hardly bears reading, but I found drawing quite a good way of comprehending what she was saying, and also recording the stories of this amazingly eloquent, generous woman. She said to me at the end, you could say I had 3 flowers in my garden. The first was eaten by the beast, and the other 2 trampled by the beast's foot as he walked away. To give you an idea of her generosity, her humanity, her affection, she adopted this little boy called another Khalid, who in the refugee camp they were living in Turkey, and Khalid was 11 when he saw his father shot by the government militia with a heavy machine gun in his own home. In Khalid's words, splitting his father in 2. Him and his mother managed to escape to the border. They got a car to the border, but on the way they were stopped at a military checkpoint, and his mother, realising what was going to happen, dropped him out of the car and told him to run, which he did, but like all little boys, he stopped at a safe distance to see what was happening, and his mum was dragged from the car, and her head was chopped off. And he was later able to go back with some other civilians and bury the body, but they never found the head. And wrapped in his Syrian opposition scarf, he sat in front of us only 20 days later, telling us these stories. I don't think I've probably never met a braver person. And even more remarkably, he went on to explain how he'd like to be a policeman and a doctor to heal the people of the war when he grew up. So it's really these 2 people that stick in my mind as people that I would hope these drawings have done justice to. They are Syria's sort of truly brave, if you like. There's this sentence that goes. There's this sort of saying at the moment that goes round. It's almost an excuse about there not being not being any good sides in Syria, and in fact, I think it's just a political excuse. This is all these civilians, the unwilling hosts of this war, are of course the good side, the side that we should be trying to support. This was the image the last thing that Malik published. So picking particular stories and then places that that they now lived. So under all these blue tarpaulin was new refugee homes inside Turkey. So I guess I don't know if that's a good time to have some lights. I guess to go back to the original point of trying to sell this idea to you, if there was one thing that I would ask people to go and do is that if you ever draw, or if drawing is something you like doing, perhaps consider it as a way of telling your own stories, not just. It's very often considered a hobby or something you might do when at the weekend or when you're retired. And if you don't draw, then please, next time you find yourself looking at a magazine or a double-page spread, please consider whether drawing could have offered you something more. I think maybe that's a good place to hand over control.
Thank you. I mean, they're all incredibly powerful, and I don't want to ask the world's most boring question, but I was quite interested in the actual sort of details of how you do the drawing, because you've talked about composites and rather than actually just sort of visualising the thing in front of you, you sort of bring a few things together. Can you just talk a little bit about the process?
Yeah. So I always work from life. So I have an A2 board, which is about this size, and then work directly in pen and ink because it just doesn't allow you to stop and to rub out. So you always get that movement, but inevitably, because you're working over a period of time, an hour or 2 hours or less, things move. So people come and go, and you pick something that's you'd like to draw, and perhaps it's a figure, and they then walk off, and then they come back, and they're in a different position. So you're really capturing habit over those 2 hours, and sometimes that means highlighting one thing, bring it a bit like you have when you lay it out on a page. I guess I'm already thinking about that a little bit. So if there's a particularly interesting character, then why shouldn't he be closer to the foreground? And then if there's something that's not very interesting, or I'm probably not really good at drawing, then I draw it smaller and at the back.
Right.
So it's a very personal thing, and if anyone else was to do it, they'd probably pick different things that attracted their attention based on who they were.
There's one of the things that sort of kept coming up when you were talking about illustration is that you say it's an open, transparent process, and people are more willing to be illustrated than photographed, for example. Was there ever any sort of hostility, and was that always the case? I sort of imagine, blonde-haired British guy, in a foreign place. I can't imagine there was always openness.
I've only ever had a sort of hostile. The only time I've ever had anybody sort of be particularly hostile to me was in Romania last year, and this gypsy guy got really angry that I was drawing in his village, and he came out, and it's actually quite a funny story. He came out and I was sitting down, and he got very, very angry very quickly, slapped me around the back of the head. So I then sort of packed up deliberately, slowly, because I just to sort of be annoying, and so he went back to his house and got a horse whip, and then chased me out of the village. I was on a bicycle, and he was just following me down the road. So the answer is occasionally. That's one time in 8 years, but it was at a moment I wouldn't have expected it. In northern Syria with the rebels, with kind of in Hezbollah parts of Lebanon last week, nothing like that. And I think it's quite often happens at the beginning when they don't understand. They might not understand why you're there. If you're a big board and a piece of paper often says that you're doing a survey, or you're there from a government, or you've got a big kind of briefcase-looking thing. And but once you've sat down and started, there's always somebody who wants to look after you, and they bring you water, and they sit down next to you, and they want to write their names on the piece of paper. And it's a real nice way of uniting people rather than I don't know. I just find maybe it's just me that when people sit to take a photo of me, I always feel like I sort of sit up and put a funny face.
Just in terms of the photographs and the illustrations, I mean, do you think illustrations can ever be as powerful as photographs, or do you think the two work together in some way?
I think they're two separate things. I think the photograph is fantastic at its job, at perhaps engaging a huge audience on the front page. But I think if you know a little bit about the subject, or if you've seen a lot of photographs of a subject, which we sometimes have now, then the illustration can be a great sort of layered way of capturing attention, especially as Martin said with that piece. If somebody's reading a feature, they quite often flick over a photograph, and an illustration is just an excuse to stop and have a look at it. The fact that you know somebody was there and was doing it, created it, I think is interesting. Someone said to me the other day, you don't often wonder who took the photograph, but if there's a painting, you think, I wonder who the person was.
Do you, out of all the pictures you've shown us, apart from the two from Syria that you talked about, I mean, do you have a particular one that you're most proud of that you?
I think the first one I did when difficult to see, but the first one I did when I turned up in Syria and started drawing. It was completely different to anything I think I'd ever known, and so I was just desperate to sit down and draw, and then finish it quickly and go and draw something else.
How long did this take?
It probably took about an hour.
Right. Okay.
And then I coloured bits of it in afterwards. So the sort of lines, I don't know if you can see, on the mosque, quite difficult to get right. I don't know what. It feels a bit odd not being able to see it.
And was the tank the place where you started? Was that the sort of heart of it, or?
Yeah. So my life drawing teacher always says drawing is about the thing that's closest to you. So you should, so I started with the tank and its turret, which was sort of stuck in the ground over here somewhere, and then the kids moving around, and these two old boys who'd come out to inspect this sort of monstrosity in the place they'd probably grown up in. And then I was aware that the other lad was inside as well, so I sort of waited, trying to get him to come out of it, and then the background sort of fits in around it, and but by the time I'd got to the foreground on the left, it was just the road, so it didn't add anything to it for me, so I thought I'd leave a bit of space for your text.
And I mean, could you talk about the most difficult image that you've drawn and illustrated? Is there one in particular out of the Syria pictures?
Yeah, I think that little the lad Ahmed without his leg was I found that very difficult, mainly because I felt like I was
You were intruding somehow.
Yeah, it was sort of an imposter on that moment of incredible vulnerability. I remember him just having this oversized oxygen mask and really sort of out of it on painkillers, and the nurse very brutal, pulling off the blankets and trying to explain exactly what it was that had happened.
It is the intimacy, isn't it, of illustration and the situation that with a camera you take the picture and you move off. With illustration you're there for a good 2 hours, and so people are reacting to you too. Yeah. I mean, is it difficult not to respond to that?
I like that sort of interaction. It doesn't feel so dismissive for me. But a lot of photographers, I think, spend ages building up the trust, and maybe you could argue that in fact you need more trust from someone to let them take a photo. But certainly that period of time spent with a person is I think important, at least only to reassure them that you're not just another guy from the press who's wants to take a picture and go off and sell it for their own benefit, which is difficult to avoid.
You started the talk just by saying, by posing the question, can we ever get back to illustration? I mean, what's the answer, and where do you see it going, and why are there so few of you?
I think, I think the mobile and the kind of ease of taking photographs is not particularly helpful in terms of doing drawings, but I don't know. I mean, I think perhaps it's a question almost for, I don't know if maybe you want to answer it. Is it not as attractive? Is it because it's more expensive, or because it's more of a risk that you can't publish them? Or is it just safer because you know you've got a photographer who can, or just fashionable, you know that you've got a photographer who can take an image of what you want, and then you can use it without, there's no risk involved in terms of answering to anybody. I don't know. There are a lot of people now at uni who do draw on location, but I don't know whether there's enough jobs for them.
Yeah. I mean, I think from our point of view, I think it's the difference between news and features. You can have the sort of instant story and the instant picture that will get you the news out there and will bring in the hits, and it will take care of your page tomorrow. And then you can have the sort of more long lead illustration that you can deliver more beautifully and tell the story in a different way. I mean, but I think at the Guardian we don't have any illustrators on staff, and I think part of what you do, you have to have the war training, you have to have security training, there are insurance issues, we can't just send freelance illustrators out to war zones, and so those logistical and practical things come into effect.
I think actually at the moment illustrators perhaps are more of an advantage in this, particularly in recording the news, because so few people do it. So if you put a drawing on a page, the chances are that people are going to stop and look at it because the last 10 pages have been a photograph. So I think for the moment it's perhaps for the next 10 years there might be an opportunity for people to do that, but it's just convincing people like you to, which I'm preaching to the choir, but all the others to use them.
I think this is where we open it up to the crowd, to the audience. Should we wait for the microphone?
There it is. Hi, I think your paintings are beautiful, actually. I just wondered what sort of training you'd had. You mentioned you'd been at university. Did you study art there, or is this something that you'd always had a passion for and kind of taught yourself?
I did illustration at Kingston. So I did a foundation first, and then 3 years basically doing this, but drawing for all sorts of different briefs, children's books and editorial things. But I guess this was the bit that I was always most passionate about, but I never really knew that it was possible to do as a career, or until I left and just started doing it.
George, you talk about drawing versus photography, and one looks at some of the photographs around this room, and the photograph is very quick, catches that moment which your 1 hour drawing isn't going to catch. Do you never photograph and draw later? And you also talked about colouring in later. Do you never photograph to remember what was that?
I know I do. I take photographs of almost all the places that I've been. Not least because it's just sometimes amazing privilege to go to them, and I think a photograph is a sort of different answer to the question. But I don't ever draw directly from a photo, or if I do, it's for reference, so getting colours or details of signs, things like that. It's very easy to take a photo and copy from it, and I think if you're going to do that, then in that sense you might as well have just taken a photo.
What about drawing from memory?
I'm not very good at it. I find it really difficult. There's certain things that you can do if you get that, you can fill in a pretty generic character a long way away, but in terms of characteristics or faces or things that you haven't seen before, like tanks or mechanics and things, it's very difficult to kind of capture it and regurgitate it.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I work for an NGO, and so I'm interested in some of the work you've been doing. And one of the challenges we constantly face is showing the need in a situation so that we can fundraise and we can advocate on an issue, but also respecting people's dignity. And it's something you've touched on a lot in this talk about how you see illustration perhaps as something that is more of a dignified process, not only the process, but the end product. I guess I was just interested to hear a bit more about that and perhaps your reflections on the people that you've drawn and how they've responded to your drawings. Perhaps also in comparison, if you've ever taken photos of how people's reactions differ between the two in terms of the dignity issue.
Yeah, I think it's a. So answer the second bit first. I think in terms of someone being drawn, I think it just shows. I'm not saying that photographers can't do this because a lot of the good ones do, but I think it just shows that you care about them. You're willing to sort of sit and spend time with them, even if you don't, perhaps. And thinking about Mama Nazik and Khalid, I think they just thought that I was as sort of interested in them, and that was quite a nice excuse to tell their story properly. And then, yeah, certainly in terms of NGOs wanting to capture their donors' attention, quite often when an NGO uses imagery, that it's to people that already understand about the cause that they're supporting. So I think illustration is quite good at when you've got people who understand about something already, at describing the scenes or the people, then there's something to relate to. And I'm not answering this very well, but something very nice about the process, the kind of handmade creative process that comes across. It's because it's so personal from start to finish, and even when you're perhaps when you're selling the picture, you usually sell it to someone who you know or to a charity that has employed you to do it. Because it's such a personal process, I think that comes across. I don't know if it's more effective in getting people to pick up the phone and call in, but maybe a combination of the two would be.
Hi, well, first of all, thanks for the talk. It was really, really interesting. What struck me most was, in such a vulnerable and emotional setting, I was wondering if the activity of drawing kind of acts as a barrier for you to kind of put the emotions that you have towards the scene into something. I was just wondering, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both. I think people have talked about how they kind of hide behind their cameras when these sorts of things happen, and the drawing board was a kind of physical barrier. And I certainly, during the little lad in the hospital, felt like it was a way of distracting myself, just copying exactly what was in front of you rather than thinking about it for too long. And then of course, things that I find the things that I care about or I'm interested in, I always draw much better. I don't know, it's just a pressure or a need or want to do it, give it justice. But certainly in Syria and in Lebanon last week, that was the case, yeah. Good question.
Thanks for the talk.
Where am I looking? Yeah.
I was just wondering what you like to draw and paint with, and considering that you're moving a lot, I presume you have a limited palette or something. And in a week like last week in Lebanon, how many drawings would you have done during the week?
I did about 8, so it's about 1 a day. And I draw with pen and ink, like a dip pen, an old school dip pen. And that's about it. I have just like a few different size pen nibs, and actually there's those Starbucks coffee stirrers very useful. Cut them into a point. For some reason, they work really well, and yeah, that's about it. As minimal as possible, and then small like pots of paints and things, watercolors. I quite often like things that I can stand up with. I just feel more comfortable. You can move and get out of the way of people and not be so imposing as sort of sitting down or getting a stool out. I think like that.
Have you tried drawing with other types?
Yeah, but I found so quite often if I'm at home, I'll draw with different things or bigger or smaller or just experiment with different things. But I actually found drawing somewhere like Syria that perhaps became less expressive, to use a cliched term, but because I was so sort of set on drawing exactly what was in front of me and describing the scene sort of accurately and for a record, if nothing else. Some of these perhaps not the best technically sort of brilliant drawings, sort of in terms of kind of economy, line and freedom and fluidity or whatever you want to talk about, but very much just sort of copies of what was there and my experience of it. So maybe it's slightly kind of restrictive in that sense. I know with the little it's just looking at me. I know with this drawing I didn't know how to put anything else in the background, so I basically just left it blank for the kind of fear of ruining it. So I think you're always up against your ability you're picking things based on your ability, and are kind of up against your ability to when you're trying to tell a story.
I have a question. One for George, one for Malik. George, so are you also up against time? I wanted to know if you're like rushing through a painting, like in the prison when the guy's intimidatingly staring at you, or do you feel kind of the pressure of getting it done speedily? And then for Malik, I wondered if you're sending a journalist off on assignment and you have the option of sending a photographer or George, I just wondered who was cheaper.
On a really boring sort of practical level, we've got staff photographers, and so they are cheaper. They're contracted, they would have had the training, and we wouldn't have to worry about insurance and all of those sorts of things. But if you're in features, you've got the longer lead time. You're telling a different type of story. You're not telling the sort of up to the minute news story. That's when you use George, and that's how we used him with the Chulov piece. That was a step back, and it was the last few months in Syria have been like this, and that's why it added something to that piece. And so, in an ideal world, we'd send both.
Yeah, and to answer your first question, in Syria, there's always kind of an issue of moving quite quickly, which actually suits me because it means that I get on with it. But this picture in particular, it's a place called Taftanaz, which was in the news a lot at the beginning of 2013, and it's still quite a dodgy area when I was there. So we could only really be there for about 20 or 30 minutes at a time, just once in fact, and then we had to move. And even at the time, there was this tank still firing rounds somewhere behind us into the town. So yeah, I quite like the idea of working quickly. It kind of makes me do it, but this is one that I coloured in afterwards to get out of the way.
When the prisoner was staring you out in the picture, anyone else would have just run, wouldn't they?
Well, he was behind bars.
Still,
I felt relatively safe, but I was really worried that because he was behind bars, maybe I was kind of taking advantage of him, and like the prison guards are a bit apt to take the piss, or there was some sort of screaming going on in the background, which was obviously not right. So they were trying to get him to shut up, so that the kind of foreigner didn't hear the bad bits going on. But no, I actually thought he was just being intimidating, but in fact he was just being wonderfully compliant. And in fact, I think I drew him twice, because when he got up and moved, he sat at the back, and so I just drew him again as a way of telling it.
Hi, thanks for showing your work tonight. I just wanted to ask if, your work is so unique in terms of how conflict is covered today in magazines and editorially. And I was just wondering if after your work ran in the Guardian, if you've had other interest from other magazines in assignments as well.
Yeah, is the answer. It's been in the Syrian stuff in particular has been in things like the Evening Standard and the Times, and then actually quite a good piece on the BBC briefly on the BBC about drawing in a strange place rather than the actual stories. But no, certainly it's now, for having kind of always worked towards that moment of getting things published properly for on the back of a news story. That's been the basis that people have now employed me on. So I think it'll be difficult to get away, maybe quite difficult to get away from that now, but we'll see. Not at the stage of trying to get away from work yet.
Speaking of prisoners, I think I saw that you drew Ian Brady when he was in court. I know this is slightly off brief here, but that differs a little bit perhaps in that we're sort of slightly familiar with the person and maybe even with his image or dated photographs perhaps. I was just curious as to how you would describe the experience of drawing him in his court appearance.
It's a very strange one because you're not actually allowed to draw in court. And he wasn't allowed to be in the room with us. So first of all, you're not allowed to draw in court. So you have to go in and either draw so that nobody sees you, or you have to go in and memorize it and then run out, which I'm terrible at. So, or go in and draw next to the other court artist who's better at it than you. But in Ian Brady's case, they would only let us into a room where we could see him on screen. So it was even more, it was sort of 2 steps away. And I guess technically it was just about memorising the characteristics that made him look like the person he was at the time. So sort of hunchback, glasses, grey hair. I still remember sort of his hands. He was incredibly confident, no signs of kind of remorse in any way, organising his papers in reply to what the judge was saying. And so trying to capture all those characteristics, go out, paint a kind of generic person doing what you remember, and then go back in and get details that make him who he is, so the shape of the nose, lips, eye sockets and things like that. But it's a strange thing, court drawing. There's a sort of very set way of doing it, and it's quite nice to be allowed to draw in pen and ink rather than those pastels which they quite often use. A lot of people don't. I don't know. A lot of people think that they don't look very good, but in their defence, they're not allowed to sit there and draw.
Hi, George. I just got 2 questions, but you can sort of choose which one you want to answer because probably only allowed one. But the first one was around when you're drawing, how much do you want to be true to the sort of art form and the stylistic part of it, and how much you want to be true to actually the story that you're telling? That's one question. The second question is not really talking about the drawing at all, but in terms of when you were there and your experiences you gained when you were there, what were the sort of great untold stories that you really came away thinking, I really need to make people aware of this because, the news or whatever is saying one thing, but actually on the ground it's totally different. And you've sort of touched on a few of them, I think, around refugee camps and stuff. And I just wondered what, if you had one in mind, what would it be?
How difficult. Well, to answer,
Sorry.
I can't remember what the first question was.
No, just go with the second.
So the stylistic one, I think, sort of in relation to story. For me, sometimes when I'm on holiday or in a different part of the world, not in Syria, it's quite nice just to draw things that you can make look good. The beach harbour or the chicken or whatever it is. But in terms of Syria, it was always any kind of opportunity to draw because there was always a story that was as important. And I think to go back to Felix Topolsky or someone like Ronald Searle, who drew in in a Japanese prisoner of war camp, it was very much their way of telling the story. And I suppose if you were being true to reportage, you'd have the two offering as much 50-50 story and a sort of good-looking picture. And then in terms of stories that perhaps need to be told, I think the latest one in Syria is perhaps this idea that for me, I just think it's quite obvious that Assad is going to stay in some shape or form, and in that case, let's work out a way of stopping the war so that people can go home, because it's not going to. That isn't an important thing for them. It may have been important 2 years ago, but they've come through so much now that actually all they would like to do is go back to their home and to carry on with life as close to what they would like it to be as possible. And that might not have been their answer when this started, but I think it is now. And there seems to be a concentration on how the Russians and Iranians and everyone should turn up in Geneva and have a conversation, and it's obviously all moving slowly in the right direction, but we really have to base it on what Syrians want, not on all the other politics. That's the only political thing I'm going to say.
Hi.
Hi.
I also love your pictures, but just to play devil's advocate for a moment, how do you counter the accusation, which, to be fair, has also been levelled at a lot of photography and cinematography, that you are in some way beautifying war and horror? It could be said, because they are such beautiful pictures, that they're almost lending a fairy tale-like quality to what is a very present war.
Yeah. It's a good question, because obviously as photographers or anybody creative, or writers, you're always learnt to make things look good, and yet the things that are in front of you don't look in any way good. I think actually, I think you can only I think people do understand that as an artist, or perhaps more difficult to understand as a photographer, that you're very much giving your interpretation on it. But yeah, so I'm trying to answer it as honestly as possible. I guess it's just about, for me, it's about being as honest to the subject as possible, and in particular the characters who I was with or that were helping me be there. So in this case, we had a family who was kind of helping me out and trying to explain it as I thought they understood it. And quite often, I think with photography, particularly press photography, you're erring on the side of shocking, and therefore people expect it always to be slightly shocking. Whereas actually, I think these drawings perhaps offer, I mean, it's difficult to say, but I think they are closer to the reality, in a sense that you're not actually trying to sensationalize it. And very often I think people expect the war to be horrific, or in a sense it's the example of Lebanon last week. People are expecting you to draw particularly horrific scenes of refugee camps, and in fact these people who are there they don't feel sorry for themselves, or they're there and there's a million of them, and almost every family is the same position, in the same place. Almost every tented settlement looks the same, and so actually to go there and take photos of things that are shocking is not necessarily true to the story. That's kind of mumbled way around that, but it made sense. Hi.
Hi. Thank you thank you for showing us your work. It's really interesting. Question on a practical level, a bit more of a practical level. Do you just, you said you did a drawing a day or so over the last week or what it was. Do you find you have to warm up when drawing and keep a sketchbook? And do things go wrong and you have to sort of tear the page up and throw it away?
Yeah, there's always that fear that it's going to go wrong. But it's a bit like, I find it a bit like staying fit. If you do it every day, you become much more fluent. So certainly by the end of it, I was more confident about drawing faces and likenesses. And I was aware this time that I can draw quite quickly. So if I go to live drawing or something, I can do 10 or 15 or 20 in a day. But it's equally important to pick something that tells the story. So it's not just anything that's in front of you, but something that offers something else. Offers either goes with what the guy was saying or the guy is writing, or offers something visually that helps other people describe the situation. So there's actually a lot of my time is now spent just deciding how to, a bit like like a director might pick a shot or. I can hear you.
It's very interesting what you are doing and how you see yourself in the future. I don't know if you can live from it. I mean, it's a job and you can pay your bills from it. But how you see yourself and how you see that this you can continue with it. And which are your plans? You are a freelance, so which are your plans from it?
Yeah.
And that would be how you see yourself. I don't know, because it's something that we see that is not very. I mean, you're good on it and you have been working on it, but maybe I don't know how you see yourself in the future in that way.
Yeah. Well, I hope I can keep doing it. When Malik publishes these Lebanese drawings, I will. So my work is split half between publishing things in newspapers and then half having exhibitions and doing commissions for people, and it's quite a nice balance. So in 2 weeks' time I'm going to Romania with a charity called the Global Heritage Fund, and the brief is to describe the work they're doing there with the Saxon villages and churches, and then we'll have an exhibition in October, and as a publicity stunt and a way of raising some money. Between sort of in June, I'm going out to. I'll tell you my whole diary. In June, I'm going out to draw on an oil rig in Norway. So selling out to an oil company for a couple of days, and then we'll show the drawings. And then at the end of the year, I'm thinking about planning a trip back to Afghanistan. So at the moment I'm making a living from it, and hopefully that will just keep going. But for me, the very basic process of copying something from life and then having it published as a story that's the very pure bit of it that I enjoy, and then anything that comes off that is a way of sustaining it.
I've got two quick questions. One was just, have you ever thought about writing the text to accompany your images yourself? And the other one was, do you ever use Photoshop? I'm an illustrator, and by the time I've finished with a picture, it's got my fingerprints all over it and ink everywhere. I was wondering, do you use it to change your image or just tidy your image up a bit?
I use Photoshop firstly to stick them all together, because if I carry a scanner, I sort of scan it in 4 parts, and I quite like the kind of messiness of it. For me, it shows that it was done from life, but equally, everybody uses Photoshop now, and I think you have to compete with all the others as well. So I sometimes, rarely, because somebody will notice the difference on the wall and on the screen, but sometimes kind of take bits out and move them over a bit if I don't like them, but very rarely. But in terms of layout and things for magazines and newspapers, very useful. And then to answer your first question, I always keep a kind of diary of who I've drawn and where they were from, and so if I write anything, it's very documentary, what was said or how they felt. And I think we used those in the last thing that was published, because I read a couple of the mistakes that I'd written in the diary. But no, it's nice to. I think the story is part of it, so you've got to be willing to write that down.
George. Sorry.
Can't see you. Very loud. Yeah.
You clearly didn't join the bread queue because you were drawing it. How do you live when you're in these countries?
In the Middle East, they're incredibly good at looking after you, and it was Ramadan, but they arrived. I woke up one morning early, and this guy just got on his motorbike and went off, and came back with the vache qui rit, laughing cow triangles, and then in the evening we all sat down and someone had cooked a meal for the guys who were looking after the media HQ. But by and large, I just whatever's going. I mean, Syria was particularly interesting. I was only over there for 2 or 3 days at a time. The second time I was with a family, and they just wonderfully took it upon themselves to bring food the entire time, and it's incredibly humbling. But did
they adopt you when you arrived, or had you booked in with them in advance?
the second time, because I'd raised some money for a charity called Syria Relief, they'd sort of put me up with, not with a family, but with people distributing food there. So I arrived, and there was this lad. I swear, I thought he must have been about 14, looking after me, and we walked across the border together, and 14 going on 40, and we met this kind of group of really sort of interesting-looking lads, and they were all his mates from school, and we just got into the back of this car, and it was literally like going back sort of home where you grew up. They knew where to go and where not to go. We had to go via their aunt's house to say hello, and then kind of how it is, and then back in to sit with his father, who was this huge fat man who kind of dominated the room only in Arabic, and so it sounded odd to describe it as a kind of amazing experience because it was such horrific conditions for them, but the people, I kind of base it on the people that were around me, and they were just amazingly kind and welcoming, and never for a second kind of put themselves first, and that was one of the reasons it's so nice to come home and then have it published with Malik, because it's a kind of relief to get a commission where you can tell a bit of the story.
Malik, can I ask how you came across George's work in the first place, and the decisions that you took to use illustration as opposed to photography?
I mean, I think it was a no-brainer, really. George came in to see one of the picture editors, and then the first time I saw them and our picture editor on G2 saw them, we instantly just pounced on them and decided we would use them, because I think we'd run quite a lot of reports from Syria, insider reports, broader sort of political pieces, and you often resort to the pictures that are available, and they are the ones that everyone sees all the time, and they do capture incredible moments, but the minute you see something like this, it offers something else. And I mean, I think George said a lot of it is he doesn't actually draw, he leaves a lot of white space, and I think it's your imagination does the rest of the work, and so I think they're as haunting as as classic sort of conflict images, and so I mean the combination it does then, and again we're back to the sort of features point of stepping back and telling a different type of story. I mean, and then there is the other side of it, which is people do become sort of immune to certain types of images, and they have less of an impact on the page.
Malik, I think it was a really great choice to use George's work. They're great. Do you know of any other editors at Confined that you would recommend?
I mean, I think it was a no-brainer, really. George came in to see one of the picture editors,
other publications who are taking decisions to use illustration as opposed to photographs at the moment?
What we find on G2 is there aren't many publications like G2 or that have the sort of remit that we have, and so that's depressing generally. I can't think of. One of the sort of discussions we had when we talked about this evening was, who else we could bring in and who else could talk about George's work and other illustrators. And actually, there aren't many people that do what George does, and so, in answer to your question, I can't think of many. I think people do obviously use illustrators across various newspapers, but not for this kind of thing. But I do think when George first sort of arrived, there was an Evening Standard piece, and the Times ran one of the pictures. We went bigger on it and gave it a different spin. But so people are open to these types of images, but I just don't think there are many of them out there. There's Olivia, Kugler, who's done this for the last sort of 10 years, but I can't think of many other illustrator reporters.
No. I've got a question. Can I ask a question? Is the decision when you're employing an illustrator for this sort of thing, and maybe there haven't been any other cases, but I know you employed Ollie to do some stuff, or The Guardian did, is it a cost thing, or is it a cost safety issue, or is it we don't know whether, is it a trust, is it kind of building a relationship, we don't know whether readers will like it, or perhaps it's a bit far out to describe this?
I think it's a combination of all those things, and I think once we'd run the first set from you, then we were really keen to get our hands on the next exclusively. Yeah. There is this issue of security and insurance, and it's all the sort of boring things that the managing editor's office have to deal with, and they won't allow a general reporter just to go into a war zone, and so there is no way they would even consider a freelancer going there, and so which is why I think you've gone in mainly through charities for all the work that you've done for us, and so they will cover all of those things off. Especially when you're in a situation where at the time we talked earlier about the Sunday Times pulling photographers and journalists out of Syria, and so I think it is a combination of the two, and I think it's also sort of it's editors taking risks, and we have become incredibly conservative, and there's a smaller sort of pool that we're all swimming in, unfortunately, and it's the nature of the 24-hour news cycle that we're in. You have to get quick things up to hit traffic, so the sort of the slower long form stuff does end up taking a back seat, unfortunately.
Does anyone have any more questions? Yes.
Actually, it's for Malik, in fact. Do you have any level of which you can tell that George's work was better received in the magazine? I mean, was there a buying blip on the G2? I mean, a good reason to employ my nephew again?
Thanks. There are two ways. It's quite rare for anything on the masthead to cause a buying blip, unless it's NSA, Snowden revelations, or phone hacking, or the royal wedding, unfortunately. So we don't really know on that level, but online you can monitor traffic and you can see how many people are looking at the gallery. And I think it did well. I don't think it did sort of NSA level figures. But we do publish a lot of content that isn't traffic related or that has huge audiences, and so we will continue doing that. But we will be using George stuff again, and we will use his Lebanon stuff, as he has done such a good job selling it tonight.
There you go.
But the fact that the first piece he ever did for us won the 2 awards, is incredibly impressive. There aren't many first-time contributors to the section that could say that. So.
Any more questions? No, if you'll all join me then in thanking Malik and George so much for the speaking.